Welcome to our deep dive into a moment in history. I don't know about you, but it just feels eerily familiar to me, even though it happened centuries ago. We're talking about the yellow fever epidemic, the one that gripped Philadelphia back in 1793.
Oh, yeah.
You brought us an episode of American History Tellers about this, and we've got, we've got a real expert here. I mean,
Yeah.
you literally wrote the book,
Mm-hmm.
Feverish Bodies, Enlightened Minds. But what I think is so fascinating about this story
Mm-hmm.
is that it's not just about a deadly disease, right?
Yeah.
It's like this window into a world where science and politics, even social beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
they were all like colliding head on,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And all that shaped how people back then understood and responded to this massive crisis.
What's really striking, I think, is just how many of those same tensions that we're seeing kind of play out today, right? It's like, the debates over public health measures, the role of the government, even the nature of truth itself. Yeah. I mean, all of that stuff was present way back in 1793. Makes you wonder, how much have we actually learned,
Mhm.
Like, seriously.
It's like looking in this, I don't know, this distorted mirror or something.
Right.
We see ourselves kind of reflected in those past struggles. But I think we've got this added layer now, don't we?
Right.
With our, modern understanding of how disease works and all.
Mm-hmm.
So to get started, can you kind of paint us a picture of what Philadelphia was like back then?
Well, okay.
Like what made it so vulnerable to something like this, to an epidemic like yellow fever?
Philadelphia in 1793. Oh man, it was a bustling hub, the biggest city in the brand new United States.
I see.
And it was this huge center of commerce, strong trade ties, especially to the Caribbean. There was this French colony there, Saint-Domingue. Now this is where things get really interesting, okay? Saint-Domingue. Well, it was right in the middle of this incredibly violent revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and all this upheaval, it just totally disrupted trade, and it sent tons of refugees, tons of them, fleeing to U.S. ports.
Right.
Philadelphia was one of them. And they brought something with them, a lot more insidious than just, their belongings. They brought yellow fever.
Okay. So we've got this city. It's teeming with people. There's close contact with, ships coming in from a region that's having a yellow fever outbreak.
Yeah.
But what else is contributing to this, I don't know, this perfect storm?
Well, you can't talk about yellow fever and not talk about this one mosquito, Aedes aegypti. This species, man, it just thrives in urban environments, especially ports, with their stagnant water, all those breeding grounds. Philadelphia's infrastructure, the water barrels, the cisterns, even the puddles, it was like the perfect habitat. It was perfect for these tiny little but deadly carriers of the yellow fever virus.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing how something so small, just a mosquito, could have such a monumental impact on a city, even a nation, right?
Yeah.
But even back then, there was this debate raging about what actually caused yellow fever. There wasn't just like, oh, let's find a cure. It was this big question of what is the nature of disease itself.
Uh-huh.
So tell me about these competing theories.
Okay, so we're talking about contagionism versus localism.
Right.
And these were two schools of thought, but it went way beyond medical textbooks, Contagionist. They were the ones who believed that diseases spread directly from person to person.
Okay.
Which, makes sense to people, a lot of people, like Alexander Hamilton. He favored strong government control, especially over trade and those urban centers.
Right.
But then you had their counterparts, the localists. Their argument was that diseases, they arose from local stuff,
Okay.
environmental factors like bad air, or, you know what I mean? Miasmas emanating from decaying matter, all that stuff.
So it almost sounds like the medical debate, it was mirroring the political divide at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
Were both sides just totally wrong about yellow fever, or did they sort of get parts of it right?
Well, the fascinating thing is both sides were kind of, partially correct.
Okay.
Partially blind to the full picture, we know now, right?
Yeah.
Yellow fever is transmitted through mosquito bites, so it's not contagious in the same way as, like measles.
Right.
But those localists, they were onto something with that focus on the environmental stuff. Because all those unsanitary conditions, so common in cities, especially port cities, they created the perfect breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that were carrying the disease.
So it's like they were looking at the same problem through two different lenses, each one capturing a part of the truth.
Yeah.
but they couldn't quite put it all together.
Yeah, yeah.
But this wasn't just like, some academic debate, was it?
Right.
These beliefs had a real-world impact on how people responded to the whole epidemic.
Oh, totally. But I think to truly understand how deep this clash really was, I think we've got to look at the whole concept of common sense back in the 18th century.
Oh, interesting.
Because it wasn't just like, practicality. It was tied up with all this religious reasoning, too.
Now, that's something we don't often consider today, do we?
Yeah.
So how did religious beliefs actually affect their understanding of science and medicine back then?
Okay. Think about it like this. Back then, scientific observations, whatever they were, they had to make sense. They had to align with God's design for the world. There's this fascinating example of this whole thing.
Okay.
It has to do with, believe it or not, teeth. Doctors, back then, they were having this big debate. I mean, they were really arguing about whether humans were meant to be vegetarian.
Yeah.
And they were using, get this, they were using tooth structure as evidence.
Wow.
Like, the sharp incisors.
Yeah.
Well, those are designed for tearing, right?
Sure.
So they saw that as proof that, that a meat-based diet was part of God's plan.
Interesting.
And this wasn't like fringe thinking or anything. This debate even made it into the medical repository.
The medical repository.
The first U.S. medical journal.
Oh, wow. So even something as basic as, like, our diet, they saw it through this lens of religious reasoning.
Right.
So how did that common sense worldview, how did that affect how they thought about yellow fever?
Well, for localists, it just reinforced their belief in this idea of a locally generated disease,
Yeah.
one caused by the sin, the filth of the city.
Right.
And that fit in perfectly with those biblical teachings about cleanliness and being pure and all that. Cleaning up the city, it wasn't just about, basic hygiene. It was a spiritual duty. It was like a way to appease God,
I see.
and to cleanse the city of all this moral corruption.
It's almost like their response to this whole epidemic was totally shaped by their deeply held beliefs about, about the world, about God, about like how sin and disease were related. It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If they had seen the world differently, would they have responded to the epidemic differently?
That's a question that comes up all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it speaks to how powerful our belief systems are, how they shape how we understand the world, even when we're facing, a crisis like this. But this whole story, well, it gets even more complex when you start to think about, the influence of politics.
Politics.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's always there in the background, doesn't it?
Always.
So how did all that political stuff at the time, how did it affect the response to the epidemic?
Well, remember how we talked about those different medical theories?
Yeah.
And how they lined up with the Federalist and Republican ideologies? Well, that wasn't just, intellectual stuff. It had real-world consequences.
Right.
For how the government responded, or sometimes didn't respond,
I can see how that would cause some tension, right?
Oh, yeah.
You had the Federalists who were all about, like, strong central authority.
Right.
They'd be more likely to support stuff like, quarantines and restrictions on travel.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, you've got the Republicans who, well, they were skeptical of government getting involved in things. They probably saw the epidemic as more of a local issue, something to be dealt with through community action, not like top-down mandates.
Exactly. And all of this was happening like on a very public stage. It just fueled more fear, more uncertainty among the population.
Right.
It was almost as if the epidemic itself, it became this battleground for these bigger ideological conflicts that were going on.
Wow.
And it was the citizens, their health, their well-being, they were the ones caught in the crossfire.
It's a pretty stark reminder that even when you're facing a deadly disease, political agendas and power struggles, they can really overshadow the need to work together to find a unified response.
Yeah.
But I want to switch gears a little bit. Let's focus on one guy who really, I think, embodies this whole clash of science, politics, and social beliefs. Antoine Lavoisier.
Oh, yeah.
Now, he was this like brilliant French chemist. He made these groundbreaking discoveries about oxygen. But his story takes a kind of, unexpected turn in relation to this whole yellow fever thing. Can you tell us a little more about him?
Lavoisier. Okay, his story. It's a fascinating example of, of how scientific ideas, they can get all tangled up with political currents, and sometimes it can be, really tragic.
Yeah.
American scientists, at first, they were really into his oxygen theory.
Mm.
They saw it as this revolutionary step in chemistry. But then, the French Revolution, it became more radical, and tensions with France, they escalated. So American support for anything French...
It just went downhill.
Exactly. It started to fade.
So even though his work was groundbreaking, it was almost like it got tainted by its connection with France.
Huh.
A nation that people were starting to view with suspicion and distrust.
Exactly. And it wasn't even just about distancing themselves from, I don't know, French ideas.
Right.
The really interesting thing is that American scientists, they picked and chose parts of Lavoisier's work.
Okay.
They loved the chemical theories, but his experimental methods, forget it. Those were too radical,
I see.
Maybe even disruptive to, the established scientific order.
It's almost like they wanted to benefit from his discoveries, but they didn't want to rock the boat too much.
Yeah.
Challenge their own way of doing things. It makes you wonder, right?
Yeah.
Was this a conscious choice? Or was it just, I don't know, unconscious bias?
That's a question that's been debated for a long time, but it really highlights this crucial point.
What's that?
Scientific progress. It's not always this straight line.
Okay.
It's shaped by all this other stuff. Social things, political things, even cultural forces. And they can either hold it back or speed it up.
So even in the world of science, we see those same human patterns, those same biases, the same anxieties. It all influences how we understand the world around us. But let's move on to something that's unfortunately all too familiar today.
Okay.
Conspiracy theories. What kinds of conspiracy theories were going around Philadelphia during this outbreak?
As fear and uncertainty, as that grip tightened on the city, so did suspicion and distrust. And people, well, they were desperate, weren't they?
For answers.
Right. For answers, for someone to blame, for, I don't know, for some feeling of control in a world that was just becoming more and more chaotic, right? I mean, that's how conspiracy theories get started. They grow in that soil of anxiety.
And back then, you didn't have mass media. You didn't have the internet. So how did they spread? Were people just whispering in taverns? Were they printed in pamphlets? Or was it just friends and neighbors talking?
All of the above. I mean, rumors just spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
And they were amplified. They were fueled by all that anxiety. One of the big ones, one of the popular theories was that the political factions, they were the ones spreading the disease.
Oh, wow.
Using it as a weapon to get power or punish their rivals.
I see it.
Others said that it was the merchants. They were hiding infected stuff, putting profits ahead of public health.
It's a reminder that when there's a crisis, when people are scared and they're looking for someone to blame, those in power, they can use those fears to divide people. They further their own goals. But even with all the fear and the misinformation and the political games, there are also stories of, I don't know, incredible courage.
Oh, absolutely.
Compassion, people who risk their lives to help other people.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned the Free African Society before.
Right.
That organization formed by Epsilon Jones and Richard Allen. Tell us a little bit about them.
So the Free African Society, it was formed to help the African-American community in Philadelphia, provide them with aid and support.
Right.
Then the yellow fever epidemic hit, and they stepped up.
Yeah.
They were the ones taking care of the sick while everyone else was running away,
It's inspiring, to see how even in all that fear and chaos, people can come together, support each other. But how did the wider community react to their efforts? Were people grateful? Did they get support? Or was it more, I don't know, suspicion and prejudice?
I wish I could say it was all positive.
Yeah.
I mean, some people recognized their dedication, their selflessness.
Right.
But there were others, driven by fear and prejudice, and they accused them of all sorts of things, like taking advantage of the situation,
Wow.
even stealing from the sick and dying.
Oh my gosh. It just shows you that even when everyone's facing the same crisis, social inequalities and prejudices, they don't just disappear.
Nope.
Sometimes they even get worse when people are looking for scapegoats, or they just don't understand what's going on.
Yeah.
But the Free African Society, they didn't let those accusations stop them, did they?
No, not at all. They kept doing what they were doing, providing that much needed care, and they even documented it all.
Yeah.
It's a powerful account that challenges anyone who tried to, discredit them.
Their story, it really is a testament to the human spirit, isn't it? I mean, the power of compassion to overcome fear and the importance of standing up to injustice, even in the toughest times.
Yeah.
But the 1793 epidemic, it wasn't just about human drama and resilience. It had a big impact on the course of American history. It shaped everything from, political decisions to how the medical profession developed.
Yeah.
And we're going to explore all those lasting legacies, right?
We are.
In the next part of our deep dive, welcome back to our deep dive into the yellow fever epidemic of 1793.
Yeah.
You know, the last part, what really got me was how those early theories about the disease, even though they turned out to be wrong, they actually led to some pretty important scientific discoveries.
Yeah.
It's like by being wrong, they had to, I don't know, dig deeper.
It's a great observation, and it really shows how scientific progress, it's not always a straight line. Sometimes being wrong, well, it can be like a stepping stone, you know, to a better understanding. And with yellow fever, all that debate, all that arguing between the contagionists and the localists, it really forced them to look closely at what they thought they knew.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to, well, some pretty surprising advancements in public health, even though, you know, they didn't completely understand what was causing the disease.
So what were some of the big breakthroughs, the key ones that came out of all this investigating and debating?
Well, one of the biggest things was that the epidemic showed just how important hygiene and sanitation were. I mean, they were essential to prevent diseases from spreading. It might seem, I don't know, obvious to us now. But back then, the connection between being filthy and getting sick, well, they suspected it, but they didn't really know for sure.
Right.
And it was the localists, with their focus on the environment, who sort of accidentally pushed that idea forward.
Yeah.
So their theory about miasmas, you know, bad air, it was wrong. But it led to some practical changes that actually did make public health better.
What kinds of measures are we talking about?
Think about those public health campaigns during the epidemic. They were all about cleaning up the city, literally.
Right.
They thought that would get rid of the miasmas that were causing the disease.
Okay.
But those campaigns, they led to real improvements. They started removing garbage, they drained stagnant water, and they were encouraging people to keep themselves clean, to practice good hygiene.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it was based on, I don't know, a partly wrong idea, those actions, they messed with the breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which actually helped to limit how much the disease spread.
So even a flawed understanding can lead to good results, even if it's, you know, by accident.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder about, I don't know, luck or chance playing a role in science. But let's get back to those political tensions.
Yeah.
How did all the fear and uncertainty about the epidemic feed into the political stuff that was already going on?
The yellow fever epidemic, oh, it just made everything worse. I mean, things were already heated between the Federalists and the Republicans. And the epidemic, well, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Yeah.
The Federalists, led by guys like Alexander Hamilton, they saw the epidemic as a reason to make the central government stronger.
Right.
Especially when it came to things like trade and public health.
Mm-hmm.
They thought a strong federal government was the only way to do things like quarantines, to control how people and goods were moving around.
I see.
And to put measures in place to protect the nation from not just disease, but, you know, threats from outside.
So they saw this as a chance to grab more power and influence, to use the crisis to justify policies that they already wanted anyway.
You could definitely see it that way. But a lot of Federalists, I think, truly believed that these were the right things to do, that these measures were needed to keep people safe. I mean, they saw the epidemic as a threat to the whole nation, to its very stability. And they thought that a strong, centralized response, well, that was the only way to prevent things from getting even worse.
And on the other side, you had the Republicans, like Thomas Jefferson. They were always skeptical of the government getting involved in things. They probably saw this epidemic as, I don't know, as a threat to their idea of a decentralized republic.
Oh, absolutely. They thought it was more of a local problem, something that communities and individuals could handle better than the federal government, which they saw as distant and maybe even overreaching.
Right.
They focused on personal responsibility, on individual hygiene, and on local control over public health. And they also tried to downplay how bad the epidemic was. They saw it as something that came from the bad conditions in the cities.
Yeah.
Which, you know, just reinforced their belief that rural life was better.
So you had this clash of ideologies going on, and in the background there was this terrifying epidemic, and both sides were using it to push their own political agendas. Did anyone actually benefit from all this maneuvering? Or did it just make the country more divided when they really needed to be united?
It's a tough question. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of all this political fighting. Some say the Federalists, by taking charge and making decisions, even if they were controversial, they actually helped to control the epidemic.
Right.
They kept it from spreading to other parts of the country.
Right.
Others say the Republicans, by focusing on individual freedom and local control, they laid the foundation for a different way of handling public health, a more decentralized approach, which has had both good and bad results over the years.
It's an interesting debate, and it really shows that tension between individual freedom and what we owe to each other, to the collective.
Yeah.
And that tension, it's still around today. But let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the human cost of all this. So thousands died in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
But those numbers, they don't really tell the whole story. We need to hear from the people who lived through this to understand the fear, the grief, that sense of helplessness.
You're absolutely right. To get the real impact of the epidemic, you have to go beyond the numbers. You have to look at the personal stories, the firsthand accounts that show you what it was actually like. And one of those accounts is from Matthew Carey. He was a printer, and he wrote about the epidemic in detail.
Okay.
His writing, even though it's sometimes, influenced by his own opinions, it gives us this glimpse into the chaos, the suffering, and all the social divisions that were, exposed and made worse by the outbreak.
You mentioned earlier that Carey had some problematic views about poor people, about how they were somehow to blame for the epidemic.
Right.
Can you say more about that?
Carey, despite his good intentions, he was very much a man of his time. He had a lot of prejudice against the poor, especially immigrants, who he saw as lazy, immoral, caught up in vice.
So he thought their, supposed moral failings
Yeah.
made them more likely to get sick.
Exactly. He thought their lifestyles, their lack of hygiene, it all made them more likely to catch yellow fever and spread it.
So instead of seeing poverty as a bigger issue, a result of things they couldn't control, he blamed them for it.
Right. He blamed their character.
That's a disturbing reminder of just how deep those beliefs about poverty and class went, even among people who thought they were enlightened.
Exactly. And Carey's account, even though it's valuable, it's also a warning,
Yeah.
It tells us not to just accept historical stories without thinking about them. We have to be critical of the sources, to be aware of the biases and the assumptions that shape how people record and interpret events.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
It means we have to look for different perspectives, to dig deeper into what's not being said, which can tell us as much as the words themselves. But let's not forget those stories of hope and compassion. We've talked about the Free African Society, but were there others, other people or groups who stood up and did the right thing, who challenged those prejudices and showed us the best of humanity?
Of course. There are so many stories of everyday people, black and white, who risked their lives to take care of the sick, to be there for those who were dying, to bury the dead.
Yeah.
Doctors and nurses, they worked so hard, and many of them got sick and died too. Neighbors helped neighbors. They shared what little they had.
Right.
Churches and charities, they all stepped in to offer help and comfort.
It's inspiring, isn't it? Even with all that fear and despair, there was kindness, there was hope, and compassion was able to overcome all that hardship. But let's talk about the medical side of things. What were doctors doing back then to try to cure people who had yellow fever? I imagine it was pretty different from what we're used to today.
You could say that. This was before germ theory,
Right.
before antibiotics, before we really understood how diseases worked.
Yeah.
Doctors back then, they were working with very little knowledge.
Okay.
They were relying on observation, tradition, and, some methods that we might think are, a little strange today.
Okay, I'm intrigued and maybe a little worried. Tell us about those 18th century treatments for yellow fever. What were they doing to fight this deadly disease?
Well, one of the most common and probably the most infamous was bloodletting. It was a big favorite of Benjamin Rush.
Oh, wow.
He was a famous doctor, a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Bloodletting was based on this idea that sickness came from an imbalance of fluids in the body. They called them humors.
Bloodletting. You mean they actually drained blood from people who were already sick?
Yep.
That seems, counterproductive. Especially if someone's weak from being sick. Why do they think that would help?
Well, their logic, even though we know it's wrong now, was that if they took out some blood, they could balance out the humors, and bring down the fever.
Right.
Rush, he was really convinced that yellow fever was all about inflammation and that taking out a lot of blood was the key to surviving.
I can only imagine what that must have been like for the patients.
Yeah.
Did it actually work, or did it just make things worse?
Rush's methods, they were very controversial even back then.
I see.
He said he saved a lot of lives with bloodletting, But his critics, well, they said he was actually weakening people,
Right.
making them more likely to get infections and complications.
So it was a big risk, based on a theory that we know isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any doctors who disagreed with bloodletting, who thought maybe there was a better way?
Yes, and those doctors who disagreed, they're important. They show us how medical thinking was changing.
Okay.
Some doctors, they saw what was happening with bloodletting and other harsh treatments. They saw that it was often making things worse.
Yeah.
So they started to suggest a more cautious approach. They said, let's just focus on the symptoms, keep people hydrated, and let the body heal itself.
So they were basically admitting that they didn't know everything and that maybe doing less was better.
Exactly. And it took a long time, and
Yeah.
many more lives were lost. But those doctors who questioned the accepted ways, they were planting seeds of doubt that eventually led to a big change in how we think about medicine.
It's a great example of how progress in science, it's not always just about big discoveries. It's also about having the courage to question what everyone believes, to challenge the status quo and to argue for a more humane, evidence-based way of healing.
And we have to remember, this evolution in medical thinking, it didn't happen all on its own. It was connected to all those social, political, and religious things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
The yellow fever epidemic, in a lot of ways, it was a catalyst. It forced people to confront what they didn't know, to see how fragile their institutions were, and to really deal with that tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility.
It's a story that still resonates today, isn't it? I mean, we see those same debates happening now as we deal with new diseases, new technologies, and, new challenges to how we understand the world. But before we get into those modern connections, let's talk about some of the mysteries that still surround the 1793 epidemic.
Okay.
Are there still unanswered questions? Things that keep historians and scientists wondering, even centuries later.
Oh, absolutely. Despite all the research, there are still gaps in what we know. Things that really intrigue us.
Okay.
We'll explore those mysteries and the efforts to solve them in the last part of our deep dive.
Welcome back. We've talked about the political battles and the medical treatments, which I got to say, some of them sound, well, kind of scary looking back from today.
Yeah.
But even with everything we've learned, there's still a lot we don't know about this epidemic. It's like there are these missing pieces.
Right.
Are there specific things that researchers are still trying to figure out?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We have a lot of historical information, but there are still some big gaps. Like, one of the biggest mysteries is exactly where the outbreak in Philadelphia started. We know those ships from Saint Domingue were important, but finding that exact moment, that exact spot where the virus first showed up in the city, that's still a puzzle.
So we know the general idea, but the details, like how and when it actually happened, that's still unclear.
Yeah, pretty much. Was it one person, a passenger or a sailor who didn't even know they were sick? Or was it something in a shipment, fabric, food, something that had infected mosquitoes in it?
Right.
Or maybe it was a bunch of things happening at once, like a perfect storm that just unleashed this terrible outbreak.
It's like trying to find the very first spark that started a huge fire. You know it's there somewhere, but finding it's almost impossible.
Yeah.
Are there any, promising leads that might help solve this?
Historians are always finding new clues. They're looking at ship logs, diaries, anything that might give them an answer.
I see.
And new technology is helping too. Like, researchers are using DNA analysis now to trace the yellow fever virus, to figure out where it came from and how it's changed over time.
So we're using modern science to try and understand an epidemic that happened centuries ago.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
What other mysteries are people still fascinated by?
Another one is the way the infection seemed to spread. It was almost random.
Okay.
Even though we know about mosquitoes now, some cases just don't make sense.
How so?
Some people lived in areas that were hit really hard, but they never got sick. And others who weren't around many sick people, they died. It's like the virus was picking and choosing.
So maybe there were other things going on that we don't know about, like were some people just more likely to get infected?
That's one of the main ideas researchers are looking at. Maybe genetic differences made some people more resistant. Or maybe if they had been exposed to similar viruses before, or even if they had a different diet or were generally healthier.
So even though we understand disease a lot better now, there's still a lot we don't know about how our bodies fight off these viruses and bacteria. But this isn't just about solving puzzles for fun, is it? What can we actually learn from studying all this? I mean, why does it matter to us today?
That's a really important question. Studying old epidemics isn't just for historians. It can help us get ready for future health problems.
Okay.
By understanding how diseases spread in the past, who they affected, we can be better prepared when new threats come along.
So it's about learning from history to protect ourselves in the future. What are some of the lessons we can take away from the yellow fever epidemic?
One big one is how important public health is.
Right.
Philadelphia didn't have good sanitation, people lived crowded together, and it was hard to get medical care. All of that made the epidemic much worse.
I see.
It shows that we need strong public health systems to watch for and respond to outbreaks.
Yeah. And we saw how misinformation and distrust made things worse, too.
Exactly.
It just made it harder to control the disease. It shows how important it is to have clear, accurate information based on science.
Yeah, and to build trust between people and the health officials. That's crucial.
Absolutely. The epidemic also shows how social inequalities affect public health.
Yeah.
The poor and marginalized communities, they were hit the hardest.
Right.
We have to deal with those social and economic problems that make some people more vulnerable to disease. It's not just about medicine, it's also about justice, about making sure everyone has what they need to stay healthy.
That's right.
But even with all the tragedy, the 1793 epidemic also shows us how resilient people can be. It shows that we can innovate, and it ultimately led to scientific progress.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it really pushed forward our understanding of how diseases spread. And that laid the groundwork for germ theory and modern epidemiology.
It reminds us that even when things are really bad, we can find ways to adapt, to come up with new ideas, and to learn more to create a healthier future.
Exactly. And all the research that's still going on, it shows that learning is a process that never ends. There's always something new to discover, something new to understand. And who knows what amazing breakthroughs might be just around the corner.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. Why should this story, this exploration of an epidemic from so long ago, why should it matter to you today?
Because it's a story that goes beyond a specific time or place. It's a story about how connected our lives are, about how fragile our systems are, and about the challenges we face as humans when we're dealing with disease and uncertainty.
It reminds us that history isn't just something in a book. It's alive, it's still shaping our world today, and it challenges us to be informed, to think critically, and to be part of the conversations about science, society, and the future of public health.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it, I don't know, interesting, maybe even a little bit, well, unnerving. But most of all, we hope it's made you curious, made you want to learn more about history and how it still affects us today.